I'm Leslie. There we go. I'm Leslie. I'm the program person. The president and vice president are not here. So, and the secretary's not here either. So anyway, they're zooming in, but they're not here. So you're stuck with me tonight. I'm really happy to be able to talk to you all and to introduce Mike. But first, I want to see if anybody's. Oh, I forgot this. Sorry about that, Gloria.
Because what?
But first, dead birds.
Oh,
I have some dead birds in my freezer.
but they're not here.
No, I forgot them.
I'll be here next month.
Anybody seen anything interesting? I know, Steve, you just had a field trip up to Hogwatch.
I'm afraid we canceled that.
Oh, okay,
We just didn't have enough people.
okay, I'm sorry to hear that. Anything else interesting happening? Guys? Okay, there's lots of migrating going on now, but yeah. Some people are seeing it and some people aren't. So maybe without further ado, I'll introduce Mike. Yes.
Could I just make a brief statement about these boxes? Yeah.
It's been so long since we had live meetings, and if there were some last spring, I missed them. So this is my first live meeting in some umpty years. I just wanted to remind everybody that Past Audubon has bird boxes, and it's not springtime, so the birds aren't nesting. But these are in the garage, and they're available for people that are thinking ahead to next year. Kittitas Audubon has made a chickadee and wren box like this for sale for $15, and we've got a number of those for sale. Here's one that's a little bit of an unusual shape. Tom Goran a few years ago made some bee boxes. These are available for donation. These will hold the nests of, what is our native bee? Mason bees, yeah. So very nice for your garden.
And they really work.
Yeah, and actually several.
And then a kind gentleman with a wood shop created a whole bunch of very interesting and very different garden bird boxes. These are not really made according to specifications like the chickadee wren boxes are, but they're very cute and they would probably attract a wren in the garden. These are available just for a donation, whatever you care to give. Put it in there. Thank you.
All right. Okay, now we're going to turn to Mike. Mike has been with Department of Fish and Game, or DFW, Department of Fish and Wildlife. Here, he's based right now in Tri-Cities, and that's why he's on Zoom. He's probably one of the most popular people in the Tri-Cities Department of Fish and Wildlife right now because he has vast experience, about 14 years worth, of working on solar and wind projects in terms of the impact on the environment. And that is, I think we originally hired Mike to do wind projects, but he has been solar most recently. And some of you may be aware that there are some very large companies having their thoughts about putting very large solar farms in eastern Washington. And so there is movement afoot for those of us who care about something besides human beings to make sure that they are sited in thoughtful ways that might benefit not only human beings, but also benefit some of our, not benefit, but at least not impact too much the wildlife, birds, and plants that we have. That's what he's going to talk about tonight, is what that process is. I think a little bit of the history and what we are looking at now. There are solar companies that literally are panting to get in here and to do this. this work. And so what's happening now is there's some attempt to try to not necessarily completely put the brakes on, but at least allow for careful consideration before this construction. Mike graduated, he's actually a Midwesterner. He graduated from Minnesota, I believe. And after that, he went to work for the federal government, the Department of Fish and Wildlife for the federal government. And he was involved with various projects in various states and countries. Most interestingly, in Guam, where he did some work with brown snakes in Guam, which is an invasive species. So it was probably very interesting work. And also some work with the moorhen, as I recall.
Correct.
So, yes, so, but he, as I said, for the last 14 years, he has been with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and in the capacity of looking at these sorts of energy projects and their impacts on fish and wildlife. So that's what he's going to talk about tonight. Give him speech, Mike.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part. You guys ready? Or
Yes, we're ready.
okay, I just couldn't hear it. All right. Thanks for the great introduction. I do work for the Department of Fish and Wildlife. I am out of the Tri-Cities. I've been with the agency since 2008, when I was hired as one of 2 wind energy biologists to address all the exponential growth of the industrial wind farms in the state of Washington. When that petered out, I assumed the duties of a habitat biologist here in Benton and Franklin counties, but still kept active in the wind and renewable thing. And then when solar started making a presence here in our state about 3.5 years ago, I appointed myself the statewide technical lead for wind and solar development. I signed my letters that way, and no one complained, and no one has complained yet. I assumed the lead planner position September 1st. So it's a position I've kind of been doing, but now I'm officially doing. I will be hiring staff in the next several months, and so we'll get fully staffed out to address this. Again, thanks for having me, because you know there's stuff happening up in your neighborhood. But first, I just want to give you a little background on some of the things I've done. I think you might find it interesting and hopefully a little amusing. But first, let me get here with some. Why isn't she not? Hold on, I gotta. There we go. Hold on. You'll get mixed up, of course, as you already know. You'll get mixed up with many strange birds as you go. So be sure when you step with care and great tact, and remember that life's a great balancing act. Just never forget to be dexterous and deft, and never mix up your right foot with your left. I received this book The Places You'll Go by Dr. Seuss in the early 90s as I started a career with the federal government over in the Hawaiian Islands. I've got to see many cool places in the world, and over the last 20 years living in the state of Washington and the last 14 with Washington Fish and Wildlife, I've seen immense cool places because most of these large projects occur on private property. We were out on a site last year. This is an actual leaning house. It's leaning just the way it looks in the picture. We stopped and had lunch. And the story goes that a young married couple was living out there in the early 1900s. There were some issues with infidelity, and the well needed to be repaired. It was a deep well, and it still exists right there behind the house. And so one of the partners went down to fix the well. And while they were down there, access to get out was removed. The other partner jumped on a horse and took off for 2 days, and then sent word back that there was someone stuck in the well. So you hear a lot of cool stuff out there. But right now, tonight, we're in Kittitas County. It's a big county, 2,300 square miles, right up there in the middle of the state. But I started off on a much smaller place, the island of Guam, about 212 square miles, out on the other side of the date line in the South Pacific. To this day, my dad still asks me, when you were over there, you were a day ahead. Why didn't you give me the scores of the baseball games? And I said, Dad, it doesn't work that way. But anyway, I spent a heck of a lot of time with brown tree snakes. That was not my primary duty. I was there as a general biologist. In fact, I started off in a captive breeding program for the Guam rail, which I'll talk about real quick here in a second. But just about everywhere you went out there, there were snakes. I was leading a biologist from the Smithsonian into a cave that had swiftlets in it, and decided to do some crawling around in the boulders in the cave and caught a snake, and he took a picture. Interestingly enough, the photographer was from Lyme, Connecticut, and that's where Lyme disease at that time, it's like 25, 30 years ago, was being kind of identified and named. The birds over there were a variety, but I'm going to give you an example of what it sounded like in the jungle. You ready?
Yeah.
Did you hear that?
No.
Nothing. I'm from the Midwest, and my first time in the jungle, really in the jungle, listening for birds, because there was a report of a fruit dove. We played a tape to get someone to respond, and it sounded just like nothing. It reminded me of a very, very cold day in Minnesota. It's so cold the birds don't even sing. All the birds on the top half of the page are Guam birds, and the only ones that were left when I got there were about 50 crows, a handful of starlings, and several hundred swiftlets, which is a bird that echolocates into the caves. The bottom right are introduced birds, and the bottom left are birds found on neighboring islands. The snake also impacted seed and shorebirds. There was virtually no colonies of boobies and frigate birds and noddies anywhere on the island of Guam. I ended up doing a lot of research on wetlands and ended up doing a master's degree on the moorhen. It's a subspecies of the moorhen that only occurs over on Guam and a few of the Northern Mariana Islands. But a blast, a fun time for a young biologist. And so that was a road I took. But now I think we need to merge onto the solar expressway and start to talk about industrial solar development in Washington State. I would like to add that if anyone has any questions or comments, to interrupt me. I can't see the chat, and I have my screen adjusted so I cannot see you. I just see my presentation. So if you can't hear me very well, just interrupt. And if you got a question, just say, hey, I got a question.
Yeah, Mike, what I'll do is hand the microphone to anyone who's present who has a question, and then John can man the chats.
Okay, so we're moving on. So the technology, this question comes up quite a bit. And what does it look like in Washington State? Well, on the upper left there, we have and the far right is what's going to happen is proposed in Washington State. They're panels that collect the sun and turn it into energy. The two on the left, lower left, are those kind of reflective and collective ones that drive steam engines and heat up various salts and things like that. Those aren't happening here. There are almost all of the projects in Washington State are what we call industrial. They're feeding the big grid of electrical use in the state or in the Pacific Northwest. There are several community solar projects. Those would be ones like, might supply power to the neighborhood, so to speak. And solar parks is kind of a term you see over in Europe a lot, but those are like small, less than 100 acres, maybe 40 or 50, and they feed certain areas and uses. The ones in Washington, the one on the right is just over the border in Oregon. At the time I took that picture, it was the closest one around that I could get to. The panels follow the sun during the day, and they collect energy on both sides of the panel, primarily on the top, but the bottom side can also make energy. This one was constructed over an old, a once operational wheat field, and it has since been planted to, I don't know what they got planted there, but grass. So the overview in our state, it's been a rapid exponential times 10 growth of industrial solar facilities proposed in the state of Washington. While I've been out here on the front lines in the field, we've had people in regional and the Olympia offices working a variety of angles and issues with a variety of groups and interests to engage everyone on the issues associated with large changes to our landscape that our mission is to, restore and conserve and keep it for the public. There's many challenges, and maybe I'll hear some new ones tonight, but just right off the get-go, when you talk about buying a house or buying property, you always say location, location, location. Well, that's the same here. And in two ways. From a developer's perspective, it's very important to have certain attributes, which I'll talk about briefly. And from a conservation perspective, there's obviously things that we look at, which I'll talk about. Connectivity. These projects are so, I'll use the word secretive in nature. They hold everything so tight that they don't even know what's happening in the neighborhood around them. I've had projects that share a boundary. We're talking industrial, thousands of acre projects that share a boundary that don't even know the other one exists. That would be like you not even knowing your neighbor. And so it really kind of, it makes a challenge. There's a lot of modified habitats. With wind power projects, we talked about permanent and temporary impacts and modifications to habitats. And under solar, we've added a third category, which are called altered. And we'll talk about those briefly. Those are the things that occur under the panels. Fencing's a big issue, as you might imagine. 7-foot chain link fence with barbed wire does not do well in rural landscapes where there's lots of tumbleweeds or where there's deer and elk. And there's lots of other ones. But let's put this into perspective. Let's take a look at this over in Klickitat County. So in the foreground, we have a Lund Hill solar that's being developed. You can see those kind of rectangular blocks. And in the background, you can see the turbines associated with the operational Bighorn wind. If you'll look closely, I don't know if you can see a cursor. Can you see my cursor on the screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you see this draw I'm following? And if you look closely enough, you'll see it's surrounded by a red or orange line. So that's like that construction fencing they put up, like, I don't know, silt fence or stay out of this area kind of fencing. And so this has been one of the challenges, as you'll notice here on the right, this ends, there's no outlet. And this one, there's nothing either. And so it's a challenge of creating some connectivity through these is very important. And we'll get into that just a little bit. Other challenges. Oh, the landscape considerations. Yeah, I told you earlier that some of these projects don't even know what's happening next door. But we can't look at these as individual projects anymore down in this neighborhood. And I'll show you why, an example that's coming up. We have to look at landscapes and how these projects have the potential to change them. And a big part of the job is why I'm speaking to you tonight and why I've spoke to thousands of people and of tens and dozens of groups is just awareness and outreach. So in the last 3 years, we've gone from 16 projects up to 46. We've gone from 26,000 acres to 57,000, and that converts to from 40 up to 89 square miles. That's kind of huge, right? What does that look like? They might, people say, well, that's like, well, at least for us down here, we use the metric of driving from the Tri-Cities to Yakima, which is about 70 miles, and a half mile of solar on either side. So think of a 80-mile stretch of road that you drive and imagine a half mile of solar on either side. Whoops, other way. Now, I don't want you to forget about wind either, because they're starting to kind of come back into the picture. And there's 10 that are proposed in the state, new ones, big ones, some in your neighborhood. Well, what's behind door number 1? Let's see how these things look on the landscape, shall we? I told you we had 46 projects, covers a lot of acres, a lot of square miles, and 10 wind projects. Here's the secret dots. This map in various versions has been shown probably for the last 2 years. The only thing I've done to it is add more dots. And these represent and I'll get into this in a bit, projects that are just speculating, projects that are permitting, projects that are constructing, and projects that are operational. But you'll notice where the vast majority occur, which in an area we call the Columbia Plateau ecoregion. The newest one is down here by the Tri-Cities, and I think that before that was the way one up there up by Bellingham called Cherry Point. That's about a 1,500 acre proposed facility on some hay land. So some irrigated, not irrigated, but just some hay fields associated with a big farm. Cherry Point. Moving forward. Here we go. So there's only 2 operational in the state right now. That would be Quincy, which is up by Moses Lake, and Lind, L-I-N-D, which is in the town of Lind. 1 under construction, which is Lund Hill in Klickitat. There's a handful in permitting. Most of those are in FSEC. 1 is in Yakima County, and the vast majority are just there. We know about them, and I'll tell you how we know about them in a moment. Almost all of them are here in the Columbia Plateau. And the big thing here is that most of them haven't done anything other than request some data from us. That's how we know about them, because they made a formal request to us to get our priority habitat and species data associated with their project footprint. And we look at the wind projects. Almost all of them are right here in the Columbia Plateau, and 2 over on the west side in forest managed or commercial forest lands. Exciting. This was our question. How are we doing?
Okay, this is great, Mike, thank you.
Okay, I will continue on. Siting. This is my interpretation, my perspective. Realize I've been working with solar for close to 3 years now. And this is my impression is they're driven by the ability to acquire leases from private property. Distance to a substation is a very important factor in their equation. Economics is very important as well. So once they figure out the lease, the distance to a substation, and is it feasible, they kind of go for it, right? So they lock this stuff up, and then they say, how do we mitigate impacts? And I kind of say, well, what happened to avoid in the first place when the mitigation sequencing is avoid, minimize, and then mitigate? So sometimes, well, not sometimes, all times we're left with this lease area or project lease area that has some conservation concerns that the project is locked into because they have a lease and they've probably made some commitments on megawatts to an off-taker. And it's a tough thing to work in. But I'm an optimist. It's got me in trouble a lot lately, but I still will be an optimist because that's where I like to be. It's not all native habitats in these areas, and the projects know that. There's a lot of them that are proposed in areas where there's no native habitat. It's wheat fields, dryland wheat. Yeah, yes, that does provide some habitat, especially for sage grouse that like to hang out in fallow wheat fields up there in Douglas County. But then there's some projects that have a lot of shrub steppe and bunch grasses and stuff. And we've taken the stance WDFW has that it really the impacts to these sensitive species, both habitats and wildlife, cannot be mitigated. And when I say sensitive, I mean, that's a big, broad term. We use it a lot. But I'm really thinking like threatened and endangered birds in this state, like ferruginous hawk, sage grouse. Those come to mind because of a couple projects. And then, as I said, we just can't look at these projects individually. There's a cumulative impact, and it's not just solar. I'm down here in Benton and Franklin counties, where for 20 years, it has not stopped growing residentially, but also agriculturally. There's a large statewide program called the Voluntary Stewardship Program, which strives to work with the growers and the conservation groups so that conservation functions and values are not lost and that agriculture can continue to grow. And it's working on a small scale, but again, solar is just one of the many impacts on our landscapes. I mean, throw in fire, for example. There's another big one that we have to consider. So how do we do this impact analysis? What stuff do you look at? Well, I think when you want to buy a piece of property or build a house or something, you kind of start looking at sources and you talk to people. And I serve as the point contact for the agency. I've worked with the developers and the consultants through the wind industry. Some of them are the same companies and consultants now for solar. We know about each other, we visit, we see each other at projects and in meetings. They know to contact me. So I serve as the focal point. I reach out to the other regions where the projects are. I work with habitat, wildlife, and fisheries biologists and say, hey, this is proposed in your neighborhood. Send me what you got. What are your issues? Right off the top of your head, I don't want to take a lot of your time, but let's get me the info as quick as you can. And I'll talk to program managers and regional directors, because it's just not about biology, it's about politics too. And those program managers and regional directors operate at a different and a higher level, and they need to be aware of what's coming to the neighborhood as well, and what issues our agency might have with them. So we get all that information, and all these folks have been so responsive internally. We're so busy, but it's almost like they drop stuff and just shoot me a quick email or a couple paragraphs. But lately, I've relied heavily on Mike Schroeder, who's our sage-grouse expert, Jim Watson, who's our raptor specialist, and I've worked with a couple of our ungulate biologists, because we're doing a lot of radio collaring now of mule deer to determine their migratory patterns between winter and summer ranges, through the Cascades, down through Ellensburg, things like that. A lot of my time is spent right on the computer looking at a lot of imagery and GIS and data layers. Let's see if we can develop a history of this place. The Central Washington University Historical Aerial Photograph Project has been great. They got some cool photos from the 40s and 50s that have been really helpful. It's public data. Google that, you'll find some cool stuff. The Google Earth Time Series is pretty cool, because you can watch vegetation changes, how the things recover after fires. And then there's a lot of internal maps that we use we have public priority habitat and species data and maps, and we also have internal products that show much more sensitive data. And the key thing through all of this is to use best available science. I think if I asked you, if you went out into your backyard and you hung a shade cloth 4 feet over the ground and you hung it horizontally over your yard, would your grass change underneath your shade cloth? Or maybe a piece of plywood you could stick up, I don't know. And I think intuitively we would all say, yes, something's going to change underneath there. I don't think the grass is going to grow as best. I don't think it's going to get enough moisture. I think the soil is going to get cooler. Well, and so these are the same things we're looking at about what might happen under those panels. And there's a lot of published literature on the ecological changes to soil temperature, plants, drainage patterns, moisture content, humidity, all kinds of stuff, carbon cycling in what happens under panels. And of course, when you change and impact vegetation, you change things that want to live there. Some studies have shown that more insects show up. I think at one solar park in Germany, one place said more birds showed up that liked insects. A lot of this is intuitive, but we got to back it up, and we use best available science when we write when we're in meetings and discussing things, we talk a lot of literature, and then when we provide our comments to these agencies. Let's take a quick example. How's everybody doing? Just to check up. Everybody doing good?
So far, so good. I think no questions so far.
Okay, I'm going to take you on a little sighting example. I think this is really important here. And if I was sitting at my desk by myself, I would be dropping layer upon layer onto this base landscape I'm going to show you. That's my landscape. Some of you might recognize that area. Those are actual wind and solar projects proposed in my neighborhood. And so I would be at my computer and I would start dropping layers on this. And after about 3 or 4 layers, it gets really confusing. So I'll turn some off and I'll turn some back on. But I'm just going to give you an example of, when we look at landscape connectivity, impacts to occupied range and potential range. We use the statewide action plan layers. We use things like the Arid Lands Initiative, priority core areas and habitat linkages. I mean, it's not rocket science, but some of those projects sit in some pretty sweet spots for wildlife connectivity. Now, granted, this data you see on the right is modeled, which means it was generated by a computer, but based on good biological information. So like with a lot of the data that WDFW provides and others, they say it's modeled, it should be field verified. So there's quite a bit of on the ground work that we require of projects, both bird, bat, habitat, seasonal movements, you name it, to get a really good characterization of the site. So now I'm gonna go to the next slide. We're gonna still use the same base imagery. And we're just gonna throw this on. This is the ferruginous hawk layer, occupied range. Ugh, it gives me, I mean, just looking at this, my stomach starts to turn once again. However, I've got lots of people that are with me on this. So I turn off the ferruginous hawk layer over here in the neighborhood, and I put on sage thrasher and sage sparrow. So now, if we just look at the sage thrasher and sparrow, well, while this is great for the birds, it also tells us that maybe some of the habitat out there is functioning at a pretty high level, because those birds need some good mature shrub habitat. So that's another indicator. On the left picture there with the yellow with the ferruginous hawk, I dial that up with Jim Watson, our raptor specialist, and he sends me back other data layers based on his research of where ground squirrel colonies are at in core areas and home ranges. And I mean, we're using the best available science and the best data to describe a site based on impact analysis and conservation, and then ultimately to base any recommendations for redesigning, resiting, or just kind of working with the project to minimize impacts or avoid. And then impacts, yeah, this is kind of standard. We've got the permanent and temporary impacts, which are pretty standard for wind and solar. Your standard roads, substations, things like that. Grading and clearing, minimal on that. Grading and clearing costs a lot of money for these projects. And so we kind of recommend they don't do much at all, because it's really hard to get stuff to grow over here when there's only 8 inches of rain a year and you've scraped off all the topsoil. So here's that. Well, this used to be a permanent impact. Now it's converted. I should have changed. It's not a permanent. We called it altered, but you can't have shrubs underneath solar panels. The shrubs are going to get in the way. That's the bottom line. So it gets converted to a grassland. Well, there you have a whole change in ecology, insect association, bird association, you name it. So it becomes the altered. I talked about this earlier. If you put a piece of shade cloth or a plywood, 4 feet over your yard, changes happen when things get shaded. The first pictures I showed you, of those people walking between the panels, there's a lot of diffuse light that comes in, but research has shown that even that diffuse light, it's not the same as intense. We get 300 days of sunshine over here, and now you're kind of blocking it or diffusing it from hitting the ground directly. There's changes. This has probably been one of the more troublesome ones, is the fencing. They claim, and I don't want to say they claim, they back it up with national electrical standards, that anything that generates electricity needs to be fenced. So like a transformer, a substation, yeah, that's obvious, but these panels are creating electricity, and by code has to be fenced. So again, another impact. Great. Let's say it's grassland right now. They're not going to grade it. They're just going to put solar panels over it, and they're going to put a fence around groups of arrays and all that kind of stuff. And we've said there's still a loss. There's still an impact out there. Even though you really haven't, the only thing you put in was a fence. There's still impacts.
Mike?
Yes.
I have a question about this, the fencing, and that is, when you say that it's there by law,
Yes.
because it's considered that it generates electricity, but then everything goes underground, so could this be changed by law to make an exception for solar panels?
I do not know. I just know it's been, I wouldn't say challenged, but discussed across the country and elsewhere about fencing at solar facilities. I think in all my work and all the research, I have found one 40-acre solar park in Europe that was not fenced. So I don't know what needs to change. But those of you that are, familiar with our rural landscapes and wind and tumbleweeds, can you imagine a 3-mile long chain link fence out in the middle of nowhere on a windy day? What do you think that's going to look like? It's going to get so heavy with tumbleweeds. I just think they're going to run into some problems, but I wish there was some more. So we're looking for ideas. We continue to work with projects saying, don't fence, but they always come back that they need to fence. So that's my answer. They really don't say they need to do much for dust and snow removal. They get the panels tilted at the right angle if there's a snow event coming, and they heat up pretty quickly once it gets warm out and the snow slides off. They said they would like to mow, and we've said, if you're gonna mow, do it after the plants have gone to flower and seed and the birds have pulled off young and all that kind of stuff. Let's make it, let's make the best of it and let the habitat do its thing. Let the animals that want to live there live, and mow it when, fledging is done and germination and seed set is done and all that kind of stuff. This
Not to
is,
mention, mowing 8 inches of rain a year is an exercise in ridiculousness.
yeah, I know.
We have another question.
Yeah, it's really hard to hear you. There's like a lot of
I have a question.
go ahead.
Usually solar panels are
I cannot understand. There's so much echo. I'm sorry.
usually solar panels are like 3 feet off the ground, 4 feet off the ground. Is there any reason why they couldn't power like 10 feet off the ground to allow shrubs to habitat underneath, unless accumulation?
I think I heard you talked about the height of the panel off the ground. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, Mike.
Okay. Yeah, most of them are set.
And it can't be 10 feet off the ground to allow shrubs that grow underneath.
Right. Most of them, as proposed, the panels are about 4 to 5 feet over the ground. Yes, we have on smaller scales over in Europe, they have raised them 10 to 15 feet off the ground. They've produced crops underneath it. They're running tractors underneath it, but that's done on like a 40-acre scale or much less, proof of concept. The farmer actually gets 2 crops. He's getting paid for the solar lease and he's getting paid for his crops. We've, again, in the policy circle, working with the Department of Commerce, Department of Ecology is working on this. Everybody's trying to get this dual use thing going where get the panels up higher so that maybe you could farm or maybe leave the shrub step. It all comes down to their cost, but I'm letting other people deal with that. But yes, and we'll talk about there on the kind of one of the last couple of slides about all the other things that we're trying, that are actually being discussed right now in the state on some legislative and policy fronts. I just wanted to show you a couple examples of installation. On the left is just kind of how they do it. It reminds me of how they put in vineyards around here. They just kind of throw a pallet of posts out there, a machine comes by, punches them in, and then it's really a lot of manual labor comes in and just starts racking up panels, and they're just kind of plugging them together. There's nothing underground. Everything's hung below the panels. And the bottom left shows the Lund Hill Solar Project in Klickitat County, where they had to do some blading, a little blading there on part of the terrain. Interestingly enough, I'm going to go, let me see here. So remember this picture here on the lower left. I'm going to go back real fast here and just confuse everybody like crazy. But I want to show you something. I probably should have put these closer together, but maybe it's not here. The picture on the left is the same project. And the picture on the left is Lund Hill. It was an area they did not have to grade or blade at all. They just drove equipment, punched the posts in, hung the panels. And you can see those are like maybe 5 to 6 feet off the ground. This landscape had been regularly grazed probably for 80 years. And it wasn't the greatest forage area, rocky in spots, not much rain, pretty hard scrabble in spots. But this past spring, we had a lot of moisture in this state. And that's what that site looked like when you took the cattle off and you got a lot of moisture. There were some places out there that were like some of the best bunch grass and forbs I've seen in ages. So you talk about creating habitat or managing habitat. I guess it's kind of possible. Now let's go fast forward, confuse the group once again. According to the rules, you're not supposed to do this when you give presentations. But anyway, on the right is the standard fence. Most projects want to put up a chain link, 6 feet high, 3 strands of barbed wire. We've got most of them, almost all of them, and we have all of them away from barbed wire because of the deer and elk concern of those animals trying to get over the fence. Some are going to go 6 feet, some are going 7 feet. We've asked some to raise the fence 4 to 12 inches off the ground just to get, I guess, some movement of, badger, coyote, whatever, in and out, offer some animals. Some have gone there. We've recommended that, and instead of chain link, use a fence with 4x4 or 6x6 openings in it, just to have some more openness to the landscape. One project went with the 4x4 openings, I think 4 inches off the ground. But when you get out on that landscape, the ground is not flat. And so, we recommend 4 inches, or they say 4 inches, but there's spots where it's greater than that just because the ground is so uneven. And based on my work, coyotes will find ways underneath it. I wouldn't be surprised in years ahead if a deer or an elk doesn't make it in there once in a while. This is just an example to show a wind project and a solar project. And the one thing I want to point out here is that the solar, while it does have some issues, the landscape essentially remains open and connected. Yes, there are bird issues. Yes, there are some habitat issues, but animals still can move across the landscape. The farmer can still use his land. And if you're a public recreationist, you can still use those properties, maybe as a feel free to hunt area, or maybe a bird watching spot.
My clarification there, you actually meant wind, didn't you? As the connectivity, not the solar.
Right, and if we move to the right, that's the Lind Solar Project in Lind, Washington, just up the street from me. It's a 200-acre site, and that gives you the idea of the panel closeness. It's got a fence around it, and whatever was there on the landscape, it was some CRP and wheatland. But let's say it was a birding area or a hunting spot. Nobody's going there now, and you've cut off movement across the landscape. Yes, some animals will go around it, but you're putting industrial facilities out in the middle of a rural landscape. And there's a whole slew of literature on disturbances to wildlife and how some deal with it better than others. What's our role in this? We're involved from the get-go through permitting. And then once the project goes operational, we're part of a technical advisory committee. Our role, WDFW, is to provide, it's the second bullet, I should have put it first, is to provide expertise and recommendations to the projects. That's what our job is. We recommend you do this, we recommend you do that. The first bullet alludes to how we know about these projects. As an initial start of their desktop analysis, they need to know what's on the landscape. and they file a formal paper or internet or email request with our Priority Habitat and Species Office, and they request the secret sensitive data within 1 mile of their project location. They provide us a shape file, and in return, we send them basically a data dump of what's on the area and within 1 mile. Those shape files are sent to me, and that's how we know about them. We call those non-public. So that's why I portrayed them as dots on the map. We're trying to honor the confidentiality between the developer and us at this point. Once they go public, and when I mean public, they go to permitting, then we kind of share everything. So we provide recommendations for types of surveys, times of year that should be done. They provide us draft survey protocols. We agree to them, we modify them, we talk about them. They provide us reports of when they're done. They provide us email updates of how things are going. All along, we're talking about changes in siting, potential impacts. You got to move it out of here. What about connectivity? Got to do some more surveys over there. And so the bottom bullet summarizes again is that WDFW's role is to provide technical expertise and recommendations to the permitting authority. Both county and FSEC are the permitting authorities for these projects. And under the county, there's the critical area ordinances. Klickitat County has an energy overlay zone. There's PHS issues. Some solar projects still rely on the wind power guidelines for some mitigation ratios. Both processes are similar. In my experience, I have found that FSEC has a little bit more capacity in terms of personnel and consultants to address just the exponential just demand on them and us for work with solar projects. Counties do a great job, but they just don't have the staff and sometimes the resources to deal with these complex projects. And it's not just the economics and biology of it, it's the politics of it. There's a lot of politics and policy.
Mike,
Yes, go ahead.
For clarification, could you just explain to our audience what FSEC means?
I'm sorry, yes. So the two processes for permitting as a project, you can go through the county, which up there would be Kittitas County, or you could say, I don't want to use the county, I want to use the Energy Facility Siting Evaluation Council. It was established by the state government decades ago, primarily to deal with, I believe, large hydroelectric and maybe some nuclear, but it's about large industrial electrified facilities. On the county level, the county planning director is the one who would sign the permit, a conditional use permit and a building permit. On the FSEC side, it's the governor who signs the permit. But essentially, it's a SEPA process. You know, you've got to do the surveys. You got to avoid, minimize, and mitigate. You've got to talk about how you've done all that, and you know, you got to submit the permits. Does that help? You can, and for you all in there that are listening, you can Google, just type in those EFSEC, and let's just use, you could Google FSEC Badger Mountain Solar, and you would see all the stuff that's there on the Badger Mountain project. And you'll see the other ones too, that are in the pipeline in FSEC.
That's very helpful, thank you.
Yeah, only one project is going through county permitting, and that's over here in Yakima County. All other ones that I've talked with are going FSEC. So what are we doing? I told you I'm out on the ground field level. I told the folks, I said I need ammo and I need food, and I can keep going forever. And the ammo is just all the data and literature and, you know, just support from people. And we can keep this going with all the coordination I do. But at the regional level, the regional directors and managers in Olympia, including the director, there's regular talks with those offices you see on your screen. Governor's Office, Department of Commerce, Natural Resources, Ecology, those four are big. And there's regular conversations. Some of those I'm part of, not so much as to, interject policy, but just to make sure I don't get any surprises out in the field. And if they have any questions about the biology or technical aspects, I can answer those. I'm sure you're familiar with the least conflict solar siting that's kicking off this summer, led by WSU. And then I hope you're aware of the Audubon Washington Clean Energy Screening Tool that we're involved with, and that I think is a phenomenal thing that Audubon Washington has done.
Mike, as to the latter, we've just been made aware of that. I just like to announce that anyone who's interested, we will post that the information on the screen to how to access this on the computer. We'll publish that on our website. Kittitas Audubon website.
Okay. Just a couple more. So what we're doing on the ground is, I'll draw your attention to the upper right photo, the IKEA. That's our store, not ours, but State of Washington store in Renton. It's the largest rooftop solar installation in the state, about 4 acres. I don't know where the power goes, but if you figure it out, it could provide enough power for about 130 homes. The top 2 middle pictures are from India, where they are putting solar panels over irrigation canals. The water cools the panels. Of course, those panels heat up. The panels prevent evaporation of the canal, so a water conservation measure. It's already an impacted environment. There's no fish issues. There might be some bird issues, but it's one of those already disturbed sites. And as you all know, Washington has plenty of those. That is being seriously investigated in this state. The bottom right picture was from several years ago. It's a Photoshop thing. It's where somebody put panels over a canal in California, and at that time they were investigating the feasibility of putting panels over their irrigation canals, and it has gone from feasibility to actually happening. It's going to happen in parts of California, so that's good. And the lower left is in Europe, where as you can see, it's a smaller area. The panels are elevated quite high. They're sun tracking panels. They're going to track the sun, but I mean, just look at that. You're harvesting some grain there with a big tractor underneath a panel. Small scale, but it is doable. And with that, well, I think you know where this is at, right? And people say, well, you can't do solar there. Heck yeah, you can. Well, you can read that. So, and I guess you guys are going to have a copy of this. If anyone would like this presentation, you're welcome to get a copy of it. You can have that. But again, this goes to show you that while there's a lot of kind of flat-ish open spaces out here, which might make it easier and more economical to put in industrial solar facilities, there's a lot of rooftops over in Seattle as well. The other thing we have a lot of in our state, and you guys have seen them, are the large onion and potato storage buildings. Over here in my neighborhood in Pasco, we have number 7 and the number 11th largest Amazon distribution center in the US with no solar on the roof. These things cover hundreds and hundreds of acres. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, and the people that I mentioned to you earlier, like in the regional directors and the folks in Olympia, they're really like, come on. Solar can go other places than over shrub steppe and in the Columbia Basin. Let's get on it here. So in closing, Jonathan Siegel discovered that boredom and fear and anger are the reasons that a gull's life is so short. And with those gone from his thought, he lived a long, fine life indeed. One of my favorite books of all time. I want to thank you for your time. And the photo on the right was taken at the Badger Mountain Solar Facility in Wheat Stubble about 3 weeks ago. I really appreciate the opportunity to share this information with you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. That was very, very fun, very interesting. I do want to bring up too, when I got your name, I got your name